Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Humentum and our panelists today for our webinar on locally led, operationalizing USAID's new vision. We are very excited to have you all here, and I'm going to share a few housekeeping items before we get started. So everyone is muted on this call. We have a lot of you joining to learn about this topic, and so we want to make sure that no one is distracted from the speakers. If you have a question, please go ahead and put that in the chat. The chat will be visible to everyone unless you would like to privately send me a message or a question. I am Jessica Walker under the list of people you can message, and I'm happy to ask your question anonymously. We will get to questions near to the end of the conversation, but folks will be keeping an eye on it just to see if something is particularly relevant to the topic at hand. We are recording, so everyone will receive the recording of this panel later after we have connected the captions to everything, and we'll send it on your way with resources for staying up to date on all of our work around this topic. If you have any questions or tech issues, feel free to just message me directly and we'll get you taken care of. We are very grateful for everyone who's on this call, including the panelists, and we are excited to get started. So with that, I am introducing Humentum's CEO, Christine So, Dr. Christine So, and happy to hand it over to her.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I want to welcome everybody to today's session. It is exciting to be doing this on Zoom because we have the possibility of having so many more participants in the room, so to speak. And so that is really great. And I think that adds energy to what we're doing. I just want to make a couple of comments about that. I can see our panelists, so that's good. And I can see some of the names, but of course I can't see everybody who's here. We have over 200 people participating already. And so I invite you to do they have access to the chat, Jessica?
Yes, everyone has access. Yep.
I invite you to make full use of the chat to add your comments and questions while we go. I will try to keep an eye on the chat, but I will also be asking Jessica and Jenna to be looking at the chat, to be grabbing any questions that may come up during the session. And we will not be able to open this up to a general discussion, just given how many people we have participating. But we will try to really feed in your questions and comments to the extent we can while we go, and if not, at the end we will revisit those, and we'll definitely take some time to ask our panelists any of the questions that have come through in the chat. So I think 18 months into this, people are pretty used to this format, and so I thank you for your attention and for your engagement. So let's get started. Today we're here to talk about locally led development, loosely defined by the new humanitarian. Locally led development is the shift of power, voice, and funding to local organizations and actors. It's really thinking about having the people who work and live in the context of where the work is going on, own it and lead it. We have had a lot of discussion about this for many years at this point. USAID launched its USAID Forward program in 2010, so over a decade ago. It failed to reach its targets. The Grand Bargain of 2016 included a commitment of at least 25% of funding to local organizations. They still have that as one of its main two pillars, and they are still working towards that. We do see bipartisan support for locally led development in the US Congress, and we have hundreds of traditional USAID implementing partners supporting the current administration's move towards improving how their track record and how they do on locally led development. So we definitely have momentum in this area. Today, we are really going to be talking about and looking at the structural barriers to locally led development. We all work within a system. We work within a bureaucracy. We have entrenched systems, policies, rules, and regulations that dictate how we work, most of which have come through, for very good reasons, but now tend to get in the way of being able to be agile and to transform the way we work. We see that donors tend to be risk averse. They have accountability and stewardship for their funds and may actually put in place systems and processes that provide bottlenecks, that actually serve as bottlenecks to shifting towards locally led development. They have complex compliance regimes. They have regulatory burdens, and all of these can serve to get in the way of moving towards locally led development. Traditional implementing partners, international NGOs, the private sector, they have business models that have been really developed to work within the funding structure that exists. They have financial incentives to continue to work the way they are. We have not shifted the financial incentives yet, although there are increasing pledges in that direction. They have organizational governance and structure that perpetuate power imbalances. And individuals, the individuals that work in this system, there's skepticism, there's concern for livelihoods. There are people who have worked the way they have worked for many years, and they don't see what their role is or how they can continue to their livelihood in a new world where this shifts to another geography and another set of leaders. So all of these things can get in our way. I want to note that over the coming months, Humentum will host a series of webinars to explore this movement towards locally led and locally owned development further. Today's webinar is the first in this series, and we strive to present a wide diversity of voices and perspectives throughout the series on how to activate and operationalize transformation within the sector. We'll be sending a follow-up email to this event with more information on how you can stay informed about our future programming. Today, as I've said, and in alignment with Humentum's focus on operating models and administrative policy, we are really focusing on structural barriers, and we are looking at the way that donor-funded global development has worked until now and how we can move it to a new model. It is important to note that today we are not addressing the challenges faced by the local actors in meeting international donor expectations. That is something that we will be exploring further in this series and in other fora. We are fortunate today to be joined by a panel of distinguished professionals in the sector who will offer their insights on how we might work collectively to turn these policy propositions into reality and to overcome these structural barriers. They are Professor Gavin Churchyard, the CEO of the Orem Institute, Larry Cooley, the President Emeritus and Senior Advisor of Management Systems International, MSI, Justin Fugel, the Head of Policy at Plan International USA, Randy Tift, International Development Consultant, Oxford House Senior Associate, and the former USAID Chief A&A Policy Officer. I want to note that while I have given their current affiliations, they are people who have worked across the sector, wearing different hats for different organizations and different types of institutions. So they have a wide range of experience and expertise. John McPhail, the President and CEO of Partners of the Americas, was scheduled to be with us today. He was very sorry not to be here, but we know that we will engage with him at a further point. Before we get going, I need to just stop for a moment and point out that as far as I am concerned, Humentum has put together a great panel and a great discussion, but we have fallen short in actioning on our commitment to diversity. Our panel is composed of 6 white people, and all of our panelists are male. This is hard for me. This is where we ended up, and I needed to call this out at the beginning of this session because it is something that I personally and our organization collectively is committed to moving away from and moving towards ensuring that we have a wide diversity, not just of perspective, but of profile and personal characteristics in all that we do. We must continue as a sector and we as an organization to be intentional in ensuring a strong diversity of traditionally underrepresented voices in our forums. And we need to guarantee that the voices of those with lived contextual experience be present in each discussion. We as Humentum are committed to taking tangible action to shift the sector towards local ownership and local leadership. And we will learn from today and we will work harder in the future. You will see the results and I invite you to hold us accountable. I needed to say that. This is who we are and we will keep trying to work harder and do better. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here, and please everyone stay tuned for what we will be doing in the future. With that, I'm going to shift to the panelists and let's get started. So last November, USAID Administrator Samantha Power outlined her agenda for inclusive development. It's an agenda that makes aid more accessible, equitable, and responsive. And today we want to narrow in on one of her most ambitious targets for locally led development, which is 25% of USAID funding will go to local partners within the next 4 years. This constitutes a significant shift, and this is a challenging target to meet. We know that because, as I've already gone over, we have structural barriers and bureaucracy that have been set up to work differently, and that needs to move in order for this to happen. USAID has also said that by the end of the decade, 50% of USAID programming will place local communities in the lead. There's already been a lot of discussion about what it means for these local communities to be in the lead. And we look forward to being part of the discussion and the work that helps define that and make it a reality. So shifting to our panelists, the overarching question is, how do we operationalize Administrator Power's policy agenda without getting stymied or bottlenecked by the structural systems and impediments that may have gotten in the way of prior attempts? Let me start. I'm going to pick on Randy to start us off. Randy, you come from both a NGO background, you worked with World Vision for many years, you worked within USAID for the last several years, and you are now working in a consultancy and advisory position. And so I would love it if you could start us off what for you are some of these challenges that we need to work on to actually take Administrator Power's targets that she has announced and committed to and make them a reality. Over to you.
Christine, thank you. And thanks for your acknowledgement up front. In a way, you could almost see this as appropriate for North Americans to be reckoning with the development system we've helped develop and facilitate. And so I hope, and I really look forward to that sort of reckoning that's an ongoing discussion. So let me just say why I'm optimistic about the direction that Administrator Power has set. And the first reason is related to my own service under Administrator Mark Green in the previous administration. So what I appreciate is Administrator Power has affirmed the reforms that were initiated under her predecessor and even other predecessors. That is, there is about a 20-year trajectory of attempts to make locally led development real. And all of those have produced fruit and they've produced good lessons learned. So one thing that I very much appreciate is that Administrator Power, in I think her first testimony to Congress, named a couple of activities, programs, initiatives that had been started by predecessors. And she was willing to do that very, very clearly, giving credit to, for example, the Local Works Initiative and the New Partnerships Initiative. And she's left a team in place where we should be extremely grateful for the fact that USAID has had some continuity in terms of mid-level and some senior level staff working on locally led development in the trenches, so to speak, over a long period. And so the fact that she's also left the details on the drawing board encourages me. That's kind of my second reason. Rather than being very specific about the two main targets, she's got people working right now behind the scenes and engaging partners for input very actively with their new policies and strategies that are currently being worked on. And so it really is a bottom-up approach. And a lot of that has involved the engagement of local partners in that strategic planning. My third reason for being optimistic is there is, like never before, a demand side for reform. The experience of Administrator Shaw was difficult in part because the partner community didn't fully support some of what was called then local solutions under the broader USAID Forward Initiative. Now, I would also say there were some shortcomings to the way local solutions was structured, and that'll be my next point. But the fourth reason I'm optimistic is traditional USAID partners appear ready to support a pragmatic but ambitious reform, again, like never before. I'm sure Larry can speak to the paper that the contractors community has put out, and in the same way, groups like the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, which Justin is part of, have put out excellent thought leadership on this. And I think all of those are reason for encouragement. The main point I want to make up front is about the need to maintain what I would call a diversified toolbox with customized tools. I mentioned a moment ago the shortcoming of the Local Solutions Initiative, which goes back about 10 years now. That shortcoming was, for me, that it was only focused on a single metric, a single way of measuring success, and that was the increased use of direct awards, direct USAID awards with local partners. And what we learned, to put it very in a nutshell, is a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for most local partners. And we can talk more about what were the conditions left behind by that initiative, but there was learning from it. In the same way that the initiatives under Administrator Green brought learning, and now all of that has been folded in. So the one big point I want to make up front is about the role of the prime. So most people on this webinar will know that prime awardees are the solely responsible parties in a contract. And there are parallel understandings under assistance, cooperative agreements, and grants. The term privity of contract is often used. It really means just that only the parties that are bound by the contract can be held accountable for it. But it's often used to blind USAID and others interested in the public to the role of subaward partners. And actually, the role of subs is critical to any successful development program. And so what we initiated in my time at USAID recently is something called the strategic use of subawards. This was a big focus, especially in the last year that I was there, end of 19 and 2020. It was something initiated by the Acquisition and Assistance Labs, which had been a promising effort as well to bring innovation to how acquisition and assistance is done. The New Partnerships Initiative that I mentioned continues this focus. And when the New Partnerships Initiative was launched, we asked missions to create 2-year NPI action plans, which they did through 2019 and 2020. And they performed against important targets: the increased use of new and underutilized partners, the increased use of collaborative design, or sometimes called co-creation, in both the prime award and the subaward level. And most importantly, I would say that local capacity development was a part of every NPI award. And as a result of NPI, targets were set for all of those indicators by all missions. And it caused them to have to review the entire pool of local partners at both, again, the prime and subaward level. Who are those local partners that each mission is supporting with capacity development assistance? What is the resulting improved organizational performance? That's the metric. It's the capacity building for local development metric, CBLD 9 as it's referred to, now a required metric across all USAID programs. And what these steps further did, so they locked in the use of co-creation at the subaward level. That gives local partners the chance to really influence the design of the activity, the local capacity development piece. And what's new in the second round of 2-year action plans Administrator Power initiated recently are other important features. So a refinement period, or sometimes called an inception phase, where in the first year of implementation, you are refining the design of the award, and you're doing so in consultation with local partners who are typically sub-award partners. And a fourth thing, the accountability and feedback planning. And so you now have a required plan for accountability and local partner feedback. All these are very much details of implementation, but they're critical details. They're critical to how implementation is changing. And I wanted to take my first turn here to call out the importance of using subawards strategically. I think my colleagues will speak to the other ambition reflected in Administrator Power's Georgetown speech, which is direct awards to local partners that are fit and ready to work with USAID and the compliance requirements that go with a USAID award. But I wanted to call out the opportunity to really enhance the transparency and accountability around subawards. Let me just make one last point. I was in a focus group yesterday with several colleagues, including a couple of colleagues here, in which one of our veteran observers and thought leaders in global development, in reviewing USAID's current draft local capacity development policy. This is out on the street. I encourage everybody on this call to look for it. I'll just hold it up. This is a policy that we actually drafted during my time at USAID. It was held to be released, and it was refined and improved substantially under Administrator Power, and finally released just a few weeks ago. And I think comments are welcome through the end of January. But this colleague, who really has been a thought leader for many years, asked a question about Principle 6. There are 7 principles in this document. The 6th one is practicing mutual accountability with local partners. And this colleague asked the question, do we have to just accept that this is aspirational? Because we've talked about this since the Paris Declaration in 2005, and we have not seen real action to make it real. And so I just want to flag that and read just a quick excerpt. What is mutual accountability? It's the process by which 2 or more partners agree to be held responsible for commitments that they voluntarily make to each other. It relies on trust and consensus around shared agendas. It can be exercised in relationships whereby partners are accountable in multiple directions among numerous actors across donors, local leaders, target groups, and constituents. Local capacity development practiced with mutual accountability across USAID and local partners can foster transparent and equitable engagement. That is what we should be living up to. And I just want to say that there are things happening in the planning process right now that are going to make that real. And we'll talk a little further later on about how the rest of us beyond USAID can help make it real too.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy. You've given us a lot of different, a lot to think about, and a lot of different places that we can go with this discussion, and that's exciting. I think something that I always try to think to consider when looking at an intractable problem or a challenge moving, and how we move to a different paradigm, is around this question of incentives. I mean, even the example that you just gave about accountability, what are the incentives for people to actually want to participate in this? Accountability can be hard. It can be painful. It can, put on display the things where you're falling down and not meeting your commitments. So what are our incentives to work differently? Let me move on to Professor Churchyard, Gavin, and from your perspective, I mean, you head a large organization based in South Africa. You work across the spectrum with donors, you in a personal capacity and also in an institutional capacity. From your perspective, can you comment on some of what Randy has put out to us to start thinking about, and how, from your perspective, that resonates, and how do we make it real?
Right. Well, thanks very much, Christine, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I'm delighted that this discussion is continuing. but we need action. We need to see this really now being translated. And so I'm delighted to hear that that is likely to happen in this next period. So I may be white and male, but I do represent the voice from the global south. And so as a proudly African-based international NGO based in South Africa, but with our own investigator-initiated-led projects, both research and programs in 25 countries, I think we have learned some of these important lessons. Now, we can't decolonize, but we can certainly aspire to local leadership. And we are willing, we are ready, but there has to be a process of capacitating us to continue to assume this role. And it's not just about local being country, it's about local being South. It's South leadership for regional programs and even possibly global programs. It's South supporting South rather than necessarily North supporting South. But just to pick up on what Randall was saying around the accountability, it is clearly critically important. There will be continued reservation to invest in local partners, certainly in a substantial way, if local partners cannot be held accountable. But we need to do that in such a way that it is true leadership from the South, rather than it's sort of we've been propped up and so it's just we're perpetuating the dependency on the North by the way it is being done, which is largely how it's been happening until recently. But we need to address these structural barriers that we've been talking about. So one is going to be deliberate commitment. It requires that political leadership and commitment to do things differently, and we've got to be deliberate. And so part of the things that we really struggle with is as a local organization trying to compete for these grants is we don't get an ICRA. You know, we have to often do things using a de minimis of 10%, and yet our competitors will get an ICRA of 40, 50, 60%. And so the resources they have to bring to bear when applying for grants, for making sure they have the processes, systems, and people in place to ensure the accountability, we are competing with our hands tied behind our back because we simply don't have that. And we know, as I've traveled through Africa and India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc., there is clear leadership potential here. But it's not just at the leadership level, we need the technical experts who can deliver what is required on these grants. And so we need that additional funding to support that development, but we need the partnership, that the pairing, the mentoring, training to also acquire those skills so that we can deliver on that. When I said we perpetuate these dependencies, so for instance, some of the grants are done as umbrella grants. So the prime is the international NGO in the north, supporting the capacity building of people in the south. But that just perpetuates the problem. Unless people are given the opportunity to lead and, learn by experience, and unfortunately, there will be failures. And so from the funder's perspective, that needs to be acknowledged. But we need to provide the mentorship support and funding and the systems. So the accountability, and particularly for contracts, for instance, is onerous. I think our Aurum has built up quite substantial processes and systems, but even we really think twice about applying for a contract. And so we need to invest in those systems, make them accessible to local partners if we want to hold them accountable. And we need to change how we're doing this. So rather than the international NGOs being the prime, and then, as you mentioned, strategic subs, why not let the local people be the prime and the strategic subs are the international partners in the north? So it's a very different perspective and mindset, but with that joint accountability. because that will provide real opportunity. You know, people learn, they gain that experience by doing. When you've got someone constantly just telling you, spoon-feeding you all the time on what to do, you never really learn. So, you know, I think that has to fundamentally change. The contracts, you know, again, by design, we have to be deliberate. The contracts are designed to exclude local people, local groups applying. So if we're going to do this, we need to structure it in such a way that gives local entities the opportunity to apply for contracts, but acknowledging that they will need support to do this. And similarly with the small business opportunities, again, they are very biased to US small business rather than, you know, so it doesn't create an equal opportunity for local entities to apply. So it's really addressing those aspects, which I think is really important. Just to stress the importance of partnership. So the historic way we've done it is the partnership with the prime being in the north, the sub being in the south. But how it's tended to work is I talk about partnerships of convenience and partnerships of consequence. And typically how it works is that the international NGOs, when they are applying for a vote, will identify local entities to partner with. And those are partnerships of convenience. And, you know, acknowledge they're important. We still learn, it still brings in resources, we still deliver on, you know, much needed services. But partnerships of consequence mean you deliberately enter into that partnership with a long-term commitment to work together. And that is very different. And then as part of that partnership of consequence, you know, you can as part of that agreement say, well, you know, initially the international NGO in the north will be the prime, we will be the sub, and either transition during the period of the grants, or as we're now doing in one of our current grants, we are the prime, but being supported by our international NGO. So, you know, I want to promote more partnerships of consequence. We will still need to have partnerships of convenience, but we need more partnerships of consequence. So we also need, you know, the access to training materials that I've mentioned. And what would be very helpful is, as part of these partnerships of consequence, is if international NGOs, if the funders are willing to embed individuals that have the technical experience to live and work with us and help guide us so that we make less errors as we are trying to do this, you know, so that we talk of paying school fees, you know, so it's less painful as we're doing that. That would be really very helpful. We really need to understand the USAID context, and we need leadership exchanges where there's coaching and mentorship, and then, as I mentioned, the twinning from both sides, where we place people from the north and the south and people from the south and the north, just to create that dynamic. So I think those are some of the aspects, but we also need to work to raise the expectation of local individuals that they should expect to do this. They should demand to play a leadership role, that they actually have the capacity, that they can do this, you know, that because often we've done this for so long that people just assume we can't do it, we're not capable. And what is very clear is certainly we can, but it is going to require effort. And people have to, the local organizations need to be courageous in standing up and being counted and saying, we want to do this. We demand that we be given the right to lead our own programs, research, etc. And so as I travel, certainly in the Global South, I encourage my colleagues and peers of peer organizations to step up and play that leadership role. But we want to play it not just at a local level, we want to play it at a regional level and at a global level. There is no reason, just taking a more research perspective, for instance, why we can't identify local needs so that we are locally responsive to challenges, but do the research, develop programs, develop the innovation that will be globally relevant, so that the work we do can transform not just local policy and practice, but global policy and practice. Because often, I just commented to someone today on a grant that the NOFA was quite patronizing, because it was implying that we in the Global South do not have the capacity to step up and play a global leadership role. That is absolutely not true. We have the capacity. There are plenty of people from the South playing leadership roles in the global North. So part of what we need to do is also look at strategies to prevent the brain drain and to promote brain gain, both of our diaspora that have gone overseas, but also to invite people from the North to come work with us to really turn this around. You mentioned that there's often concern that people are fearful of entering this new way of doing things. That this is how they've always done it, that it may mean losing jobs, etc. One thing I'm quite convinced about is that it will be a different way of working.
So why don't you tell me how to get to the...
Empower the Global South to play this local leadership role. It will mean more work, more jobs for everybody, because you have local people thinking, applying their minds, developing, identify many more needs. And so for me, this is a growth opportunity rather than something to be fearful of, because it's going to reduce, what the North is going to have to do. It's going to be different, but I can't see that it's going to, to really compromise international NGOs. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak.
Great, thank you so much. And I think what your final point was so important is, to some extent, we may have a finite universe of funding, but it is thinking outside of the box of how we organize the pieces, who does what, and what the expectations are, that helps us manage that finite universe in a way that does not seem like a win for some and a loss for others. But it really does require thinking about doing what we've done for decades in a very different way. And that is uncomfortable for a lot of people. But I do think we are, in fact, catching on, and there is momentum in this direction.
Just add, it's uncomfortable for people from the North and the South.
Yes.
Local development, it's uncomfortable for people to now step up into this leadership role, take that accountability when they haven't done that before. So it's challenging for everyone.
No, and I think that I can speak from Humentum's perspective. We do a lot of convening and advocacy work, especially with the INGO community, around working with USAID on these policies and regulations and requirements. And, even that, it is a challenge for a lot of INGOs to be able to use their voice to speak up to the donor. They have a vested interest in not annoying a donor because they actually want to be receiving those funds. And so, there is a role for organizations like Humentum and some of our other, sister organizations to play that convening and advocacy role. That does not really exist in the same way yet for partners in the Global South. And so, it is daunting to have to stand up to somebody who you are expecting to fund you and tell them that you disagree with the way that they're structuring your contract. So I think that is an area that really does require more examination and will be important in helping local, national, and regional organizations and networks be able to voice their concerns and their priorities in a way that donors have to listen to them. So that is somewhere we should go with that. I just also wanted to note, I really appreciate the way that you were categorizing partnership and partnerships of convenience, partnerships of consequence. I adhere to this idea of a partnership of consequence, but I think that actually, if we look at the way, for example, that USAID funds, it's a short, 3-5 year funding cycle. It pressures traditionally Northern INGOs to choose subs that are local partners. Those local partners typically go non-exclusive, so they may be on multiple bids, and so in their best interest. But it does mean that it structurally is harder to set up those partnerships of consequence that are long-term commitments. And so, immediately I thought of, here's a structural barrier to actually helping what you are saying needs to happen actually become a reality.
There could be funding to establish partnerships of consequence.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
But what we have done is we have deliberately sought to establish partnerships of consequence, not linked to any grants. So this is part of the strategy, our strategy, to be sustainable and play this local leadership role. And so we've been setting up these partnerships of consequence. And I must say it has made a tremendous difference. And we have identified international partners who have been willing to work with us on this, this basis where we are working as equal partners. So I think our experience is that it's a good model.
And I think we should go to you and look at how we can make a case study out of that and promote that model so that people can learn from that. Yeah. Let me shift. I'm going to move over to Larry. And Larry, I was wondering if you could pick up on this issue around this finite universe of funding, the shifting around of roles and vested interest in how things work. And really, if you could talk a little bit on the theme of incentives. And I mean, you have a wide perspective from your various experiences, and it would be great to hear what you think of all of this, especially coming from the contractor perspective. Thanks.
Let me try, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to take a little bit different tack on this, and that I'm going to try to be as operational as I can be about some of the dynamics of this. The industry of which I was a part for such a long time was really a creation of USAID. USAID, in a sense, in deciding to do things through third parties rather than directly, gave rise to what's now a very large consulting industry in the United States, and also to quite a number of the NGOs that currently operate in and around the US foreign assistance arena. And the programs operated in large measure in countries that were aid dependent. Well, several things have changed since then, one of which is the principal countries in which we've operated for many years are, for the most part, not aid dependent anymore. They're aid recipient, but they're not aid dependent, with the exception of a relatively small number of fragile states. And they also have large and capable institutions of the sort that were just discussed in this. So the dynamic of this, both on the giving side and on the receiving side, I think have changed quite substantially. It's also the case that the organizations, because they grew up, the US-based organizations, because they grew up in response to a demand and a need, are very well tailored to meeting that demand and need. So you can imagine a world where you say, okay, let's just switch the name tags on this, and let's change country codes, and let's just have a group of local organizations basically perform the same function that the international organizations played. Personally, I think that would be a pretty shallow notion of what locally led means. It would substitute local agency in one sense, but not local voice in the sense of what the programs are and how they should be. So I hope that this current trend toward locally led really means locally led, not just substituting one set of agents for another on this. And trying to figure out how to make a reality of that, to me, is the bigger proposition we're involved in. It would be a shame, I'll just take this one step further, if the consequence was built around a notion of quotas to basically create a set of mini-me's in the global South, which look exactly like the industry that was created in the global North, and basically is set up tailored to respond to USAID requirements and demands. Why would that be bad? Because I think some of those demands and needs are very much best practice, but a lot of them are really US government requirements. And if you were designing for the local need with the aspiration that it would not be an aid-dependent function, it would be a local function performing just like NGOs do in the United States, just like firms do in the United States. And it would have a variety of clients, just like they do here. You would want it to have parameters that really work locally, where they are built to serve a local need locally and have as one of their clients or one of their funding sources, the US government and other international donors. So if you start from there and you say, well, what are the structural barriers to that? I think many of them are of our own creation. And I agree with you, Christine, that some of them have now kind of enshrined themselves in incentives, but there are real structural issues also that are not strictly incentive based on this, that have to do with, for example, how much you have to invest up front to bid on a USAID contract, and how many local firms are able and willing to make that level of investment to make something happen. What is it really required to have a competitive system? And how do you create something where organizations really are acknowledged for their accomplishments and somehow judged by their past performance? We've done something like that on the US side. What would it take to do something like that on the host country side? How do we do things where the elapsed times are not so egregious, where you're not waiting a year or two to get a response on something, which is something that most local organizations are in no position to do? How do you take some of the compliance requirements that are really US-centric and redefine them or reduce them for a local situation? And what are we prepared to do in terms of the risk profile if, as I think people have rightly said, at least initially, there's some increased exposure by going to providers that haven't had the same level of past experience working with the US government on things. But I think there are the paper that Jean Gilson, Indira Alawali, and I wrote for CIDC's bequest was really an effort to get as operational as we could about what could be done to reduce those kinds of barriers if people were willing to do it. And I think there are a series of practices, a series of policies, and a series of, you could call it laws and regulations, some of which USAID has direct control over, some of which are congressionally or otherwise mandated, which if changed would make a really big difference in this. And if you want, I could dig down a little into what some of those are, but I think it's quite a long list of things, any one of which would make some incremental contribution. Randy alluded to some of them, the list goes on, but I think people need to decide what they're willing to invest and what they're willing to trade off in order to make those things possible. I'll just say one thing on the issue of incentives, which is, I think it's true that there's a little bit of a zero-sum quality to this, but I share the view that that's not, it would be a shame to focus exclusively on that, because look to the future. It's not going to be a world that's dictated by givers and takers on this thing. This is a much more interdependent world than that. And the firms and the NGOs that operate in that world, the ones that do it best, will be successful in that arena, but they won't be successful exclusively in the old model of delivering a grant or a contract on behalf of the US government and acting as an agent of the US government to implement programs. It will be that plus an array of other things. And so for me, this is an internal issue for each one of our organizations, but I don't think it's necessary or even helpful to think of this as being essentially a source of resistance. I think it's simply a dynamic of change.
Thank you, Larry. That is so true. And I think we tend, I mean, I myself was talking about a finite universe. You use the term zero sum. I think we tend to lean immediately into that paradigm. And in fact, we do need to think of it differently. It also is around the expanding and diversifying resource base and funding base for a lot of the work. USAID used to hold a role in terms of its preponderance as a donor, which, I mean, while US money is still extremely important, we definitely have seen a shifting towards having more different kinds of funding coming and different ways of working.
I'll just, if I could just say two things
Sure.
about that. One is that I think it does put a premium on donor coordination on this, because to ask local providers to respond separately to a range of very different requirements from different donors adds even one more burden to this, and a temptation to become a one horse pony. No, not a one horse pony, whatever that phrase, whatever that phrase. But the other, I think, dimension of this is that I did an assessment recently and about the ratio of foreign assistance to domestic resource mobilization in some of the countries where I was most involved. And it's now averaging in a lot of the countries that were traditional aid recipients in the 1 to 25 to 1 to 30 range. In other words, there are $30 of domestic resource mobilization for every dollar of foreign assistance. Not so in the most fragile states, but in most of these other places. So to think of foreign aid as the game changer in this, I think is a somewhat dated perspective on where the major change has to happen. I'm not diminishing the importance of changing how USAID and other donors spend their money. It's important, but it's not the only show in town. And these organizations that we're asking to respond to us on this, us meaning the US, need to and should be and do also orient themselves to a range of other sources of funding that need to be prominent in their thinking about how they comport themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And I think there's donor coordination. And then actually, I think, you know, as Northern implementing organizations, there is coordination that we can do across our own organizations that can help the way that we work with organizations in other countries. So for example, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about, you know, that particular organization is, as so many, looking for local partners to be their sub. But again, subs go into competitions as non-exclusive, which means that they may be working with 3 or 4 teams for the same competition. And each one of those primes is vetting them and asking them to respond to their vetting requests, which, while there may be a little overlap, but there's a great deal of difference. And so we are taking the time and effort and energy of the local and national organizations. We're saying, in order to participate at all, you have to work with us as a sub. If you want to do that, you have to jump through all these hoops, and we're going to make you do it 2 or 3 or 4 times. And to Gavin's point, we're not going to pay you NICRA once we give you the award. You're going to get a de minimis of 10%, and you know, you're not going to have the funding that you need to be able to support you to do all of these things in a way that allows you to be a fully active participating partner. And so, I mean, that is a poverty trap. That results in organizations not being able to organize themselves to be competitive or to be able to speak up, because they are constantly on the wheel trying to keep themselves going in an under-resourced environment. I'm going to shift over to Justin. Justin, you work with Plan International USA, which is part of a global federation, but you're also very active in MFAN and do a lot of thinking about this. I'm going to leave it open for you to what in all of this is resonating with you, and what do you want to say?
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody. The chat's been very interesting as we've gone along. It's a lot of good topics are being raised there. I mean, I would pick up on a number of things that have been said and add a few more things. I think that the procurement reforms that USAID has been doing are very important. They're too hard to work with. They don't need to be that hard to work with. There's a lot of things that can be done there. Too many decisions are being made in Washington, right? Way, way before the money ever hits the ground. The advocacy community here is always asking for earmarks from Congress. Congress earmarks the money. By the time USAID gets it, it's got flavors, it's got countries, there's no flexibility. You can't respond to local priorities even if you want to. So those are a couple of things. But the thing I think I would stress here is compliance, right? We've been talking about it, how the USAID compliance barriers are so high for local organizations. And I think we really need to question why that is. Is that really justified? Should USAID's compliance requirements be so high? And what I would ask you to think about is the fact that the MCC gives funding to local organizations and to local governments. Why doesn't USAID give money to those same governments, right? Those are taxpayer dollars that the MCC is safeguarding. And they have said that those governments are safe to work with and those NGOs are safe to work with. So why doesn't USAID just accept that MCC safeguards are sufficient and also work with those partners? You've also got another example of the Inter-American Foundation, also part of the US government, that since 1969 has been making grants to local organizations. They don't have a huge corruption problem. They don't have a huge waste, fraud, and abuse problem. The Inter-American Foundation doesn't even have any staff in country, right? They operate from a small office here in Washington, right? So they have a model where you can grant US taxpayer dollars to local NGOs successfully without anywhere near the compliance burdens that USAID has. The MCC also does, right? And so are the compliance burdens at USAID a little bit of a result of advocacy by the US development community to make USAID so difficult to work with that they have to keep flowing their funding through us, right? And I think it's a legitimate question to ask. Because if you look at local solutions, right, that many folks around town feel that lobbying was done during local solutions to raise a lot of fear about corruption. And that led to something called the PIFM-RAF, which is this very difficult process inside USAID that makes it almost impossible for them to do government-to-government funding. And so are those things still justified? And are some of those barriers left over from a time where people were very skeptical about being able to work with local organizations and local governments? And are they still justified anymore? I think they're probably not, right? Deegan Ali from Adesso testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She said a lot of the concern about compliance is frankly racist, right? And I think we need to look at that. Why is it that we are so ready to say, well, geez, you can't give money to them. You know, we shouldn't give our money to them. It won't be safe anymore. Give it to some American organization. But if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, a lot of money went through American organizations and leaked out all over the place. Or we know what happened with AED years ago and with IRD. So, I mean, that's not legitimate either, but somehow giving money to American organizations keeps it safe. So I think we really need to look at this debate because we accept that as a given. The compliance barriers are too high, it's scary for the global South. You need to build their capacity and all of these things. And in fact, I think a lot of those barriers probably need to be taken down because the Inter-American Foundation and the MCC also have to work with OMB, right? And so does state, and so does OFDA, now BHA. And they don't have all of the requirements that make it so hard to work with USAID. So that's one thing I would put on the table. The other thing I would put on the table is the role of USAID's own local staff. We know that during COVID, the local staff were running the missions because the Americans were evacuated. And by all reports, they seem to have done a very good job, right? And so isn't it time to give the local staff more authority to sign contracts, more authority to really represent USAID in country, because that would help them tap their networks and bring in a lot of the local actors, a lot of the local NGOs. We know that now one of the informal barriers to making this work is that a lot of conversation goes on among the Americans on the weekend at the American school, at the 4th of July picnic. The local organizations are not there, right? And they're losing out on those opportunities. So I do think that there are a number of things around compliance. Barriers probably can come down. They probably don't need to be so high. And there's a lot to be learned by what some other US government agencies are doing to make it more possible for US taxpayer dollars to flow to local organizations. And also more about how the local staff can take more of these leadership roles inside USAID and help to really, practice what we're preaching around DEI and recognizing the much increased capacity of local staff. And many of them have been working for the missions for 30 years, right? They're some of the most qualified people you'll ever find. And there's no reason that they should not be taking these leadership positions. So in addition to a number of things that have been covered, I would put some of those topics on the table.
Great, thank you, Justin. I am going to send this back to Randy in just a minute because I'd love your thoughts, especially around this compliance issue. And I really thank you, Justin, for the way that you framed it. I think that's spot on. I do want to several people have mentioned things around the human resources area, who is in a position to take decisions, who has authority, who has decision-making power, who has budgetary power. And so I think we need to think of this around the traditional partners and the expat model. We did see immediately with COVID, we saw the expats all came back or they went back to their home countries, and it did shift how organizations needed to work. Now, on the whole, this was incredibly successful, and now we are seeing snapback. And people have vested interests to maintain their livelihoods, to maintain their jobs. And there is, I think we have an uncomfortable tension around this now because we know what is right, but we don't necessarily see complete follow through on this. I think we are seeing some organizations move towards having distributed leadership, regardless of where their headquarters are. They are talking less about headquarters. They are now doing global recruitment for their staff, for their leadership, and they're putting authority and decision-making in the hands of those people, regardless of where they are. I think that's definitely a step forward. Justin, you mentioned staffing in local USAID missions. I think there are many, but there are at least two great big issues. One is around, again, what will the US government give in terms of authority and power to locally hired staff? So that is one. And the second is that we know that, for example, if we're talking about giving funding to multiple local organizations in prime awards, it means that is many awards that need to be managed. And we know that USAID missions do not have the contracting staff. If we are working in the system that we have right now, we don't have the contracting staff to support a disaggregation of the contracting mechanism. Because, I mean, I was at USAID, I left USAID in 2008, and even then, we didn't have enough contracting staff, we still don't, and at that point, we were really looking at creating larger and larger mechanisms. So we very definitely have staffing issues and HR issues that need to be addressed and that are part of the bottlenecks that we are confronting. With that, I'm actually going to shift back to Randy. Randy, Justin raised the issue of compliance. I think he laid out very well how we've got inconsistency across the US government in terms of compliance regulations and requirements. We know that a lot of the compliance rules were put in place many years ago, but they have become entrenched. And one of the things that Humentum has been working with the US government on, and Randy, we worked with you when you were still in the administration on this, was, what were the COVID flexibilities around contracting, around rules, and the fact that we found that the flexibilities that were introduced were actually very successful. People really liked them, they worked, and so we have been working to make them permanent. So I think that's an example where we've actually been forced into flexibilities where we've tried to keep them going. So Randy, can you speak to some of this? Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. And thanks. All the comments, both in the chat and from my colleagues here, have really been excellent. So rather than a deeper dive on Justin's point on compliance, there is no question it is full of barnacles, things that do not need to be required steps. And yet when you go to people who are leading sectoral programming, let's say, that require multiple, and I'll just be honest, there are several gender compliance requirements that are required with every award, not just one, but actually multiple, several on the environment and climate. These are the things that we actually value in many ways because they help us get things right, but they also slow everything down. So it is a really tough call with some of this. Other compliance requirements we did chip away at. We under what was mentioned earlier, the Effective Partnering and Procurement Reform Initiative, which I co-led, we actually refined and streamlined the whole program cycle operational policy. We removed steps entirely from that process. Now that's not seen and felt as directly by an implementing partner, but it is going to make the design process and some of the things that we expanded, like the use of two-step approaches. So the first step in a procurement or a solicitation is a 3-page concept paper. That brings local partners to the table. Co-creation, if it's managed well and if it's not overwrought with process itself, but if it's targeted, brings local partners into the room where designs are done. And then all the way on the implementation side, the adaptation approaches you mentioned, Christine, that we introduced within operational policy, and some of the steps that are now being expanded beyond the new partnerships initiative as agency-wide, adaptive and co-creative approaches in implementation, bringing local partners again to the table. Those are things that are steps in the right direction, but it still isn't taking down a lot of the burden. Let me just say something about the use of authorities. So very similar to the compliance issue, we have a challenge. Justin is 100% right. Way too many decisions are made in Washington, and I'll give you a few examples. This is one of the reasons why the other point Justin raised about, or you raised actually, Christine, about contracting officers and the need to expand or maintain that workforce is also facing a challenge. So what do I mean? We introduced several reforms under Mark Green that have huge promise to reduce burdens and barriers and streamline the process. On the acquisition side, the use of phased acquisition, that is two-step processes toward a contract, has been almost completely unused. And the reason is it's not trained, it's not supported, it's not encouraged by Washington. So when a few field-based contracting officers started to use it, we pushed back on the more senior people in the career ranks of USAID and said, no, we're going to move this forward. We're going to create training. We're going to make our own internal rules easier so that two-step acquisition can work. It's basically a technical proposal up front and a cost proposal at the second stage. And that allows local firms to be more competitive. Things like the use of changes clause. How do we be adaptive under acquisition? Are things we introduced, but I'm worried that they're flagging a little bit since the change of administration. I think there's commitment, but there needs to be a real focus on those things. Under assistance, we created enhanced substantial involvement. Now, some implementing partners don't like that additional scrutiny on assistance awards, but in fact, what we introduced means more empowerment to local or sub-award partners. And again, I really think we have to consider that tool important. A traditional prime with local subs needs to, through these changes to policy and through our own change in culture and the way we think about partnership, elevating the role of those sub-award partners that are usually local partners to play a more important role. There are new collaboration models being developed across USAID. There's a study going on right now that's going to bring these to the fore. And I think managing collaboratively across different awards is another way of elevating local partners to be part of what a mission is doing to implement a development agenda and a country-led plan. So one last point about compliance and about the use of existing authorities in the federal acquisition regulations and its counterpart on the assistance side, the 22 CFR. because these authorities that often flow to a contracting officer individually are suppressed or restrained, we are losing contracting officers. An example I gave earlier in my first answer related to the acquisition and assistance labs. In that case, it became so difficult for the person assigned to lead that portfolio that they actually resigned from the agency and left. And that was one example among many. The attrition of contracting officers is happening, I believe, because they are not empowered to use the authorities they have. And too much is being driven by Washington. We changed a lot of that. We put things in place that are still on track, but that needs to be a big focus. The empowerment of the most energetic and creative USAID staff, especially field staff, to be in the driver's seat in managing awards differently, changing the way we look at partnership, and making sure that we empower prime or local partners, whether they're prime awards or sub awards. I think there's a real energy for that, meeting that challenge. And as Justin and others have said, we need to look at some of these details of how we manage and USAID's internal operational policy. Just the last point on COVID, Christine, it was not really a success. The way the first year of COVID response was implemented, we actually shifted backwards on local partnership. And that's because the decision was made to quickly put money in existing contracts and assistance awards with no accountability for engaging local partners and no plan, even though, as Justin pointed out, the expat leadership had left the host country. So that was not a success story. And I hope it's changing, and I think it is.
Thanks, Randy. I will just add a nuance to that. I think what you're saying is completely valid about that COVID experience. Speaking from the implementing partner perspective, I think implementing partners saw that on the whole, their leadership was taken over by local employees in a pretty successful way. And so I think it's the same question, but seen from different perspectives, there are definitely different opinions on that.
And I think that's a tribute to the field-based leadership, both of USAID and the implementing partners.
Yeah, yeah. One question that I wanted to ask you about, I mean, I hear what you're saying about compliance and existing authorities, and frankly, the demotivation of contracting officers. How do we change this? How do we get them to be empowered to use the authorities that they have? What pressure do we put to move that authority from DC to the missions?
Well, Administrator Power has asked for additional funding through the appropriations process. And this was in her budget testimony in the spring or early summer, that because of the attrition of contracting officers, there needs to be a wholesale effort to get more contracting officers on board in USAID. And I think by extension, acquisition and assistance specialists, who tend to be the Foreign Service nationals serving at the mission level. Here's the problem. Agree, we need to reinforce and strengthen the contracting officer workforce. They are the ones solely responsible, fiduciary and legally, to manage and oversee those awards and hold partners accountable. But under Administrator Green, we actually went through this. In the middle of 2018, I led an initiative under the part of the reform that I was leading to increase the CO workforce by 30%. And we succeeded. Now on the civil service side, you can do that more easily. There are COs within other parts of the federal government that may be hired to come in and bolster your workforce. But on the foreign service side, you have to start from the beginning. Somebody comes in at the entry level and it takes 5 years to be fully warranted. So you're not going to solve that problem overnight, but we started to, and we achieved that 30% increase, which is a new hire of 40 plus foreign service contracting officers in an 18-month period. We met our goal. But in that very same 18-month period, we lost the exact same number of COs, and they were not entry level. They were some of the more senior, or even I would say the mid-career, sort of 5 to 15 years in, contracting officers who are the most ambitious, mission-driven. They were the ones who led our reform effort, who wrote the policies that we implemented under Mark Green. We lost so many of those people. I just gave one example, but I could give more. And I believe it's because they are not incentivized through promotion structures, through career ladders and evaluations, and because they're often, their existing authorities to act as COs are suppressed in the ways I described. So it's not enough for administrator power to call for more hiring of COs. There have to be conditions. And I would hope that you could advocate for those conditions, the empowerment of COs and other, there's also the project manager, some of your listeners will know the agreement officers represented, the contracting officers represented, the technical people also need that accountability and empowerment internally. There need to be conditions associated with any new funding, because we'll just repeat the process of hiring people at the lower end and losing people at the top. And there needs to be a really ambitious effort to keep those people who are 20 years in and might retire, and elevate and create promotion opportunities for those COs and other staff. I know that's really in the weeds for some of your listeners, our listeners, but it's an important issue.
It is very much. And I think that, there have always been concerns around career ladders and hiring mechanisms within USAID, both on the local side and also on the US side. And there have been some reforms, but it is evident, and you are speaking to the fact that there is still much more needed. I am just, sorry,
could I chime in on this also?
Yeah, please, Justin, go ahead.
No, I mean, because what Randy's saying is very true. And of course, we were working on this when he was at USAID, and it is, you actually have to solve this problem if you want localization to happen, right? It is core to this. It is in the weeds, but it's also very central to this. And the great thing was that Samantha Power recognized it, right? She mentioned this in her speech in Georgetown, where she laid out the policy. And as Paul Foldes pointed out in the chat, she pointed out that very important statistic, which is that the contracting officers at USAID are managing 4 times the funding that the contracting officers at DoD are managing, right? Which does seem unfair and could certainly lead people to want to leave. But there's also the idea that people are leaving. The folks who stay, as we know, are the local staff, right? The Foreign Service nationals and others who've been in the missions for decades. And one good way to make progress on this is to give warrants to local staff who are well qualified, and which there are many. And then you can build up the contracting officer pool, and also increase diversity and have a lot more local contacts all at the same time. And I know that is a proposal that they are kicking around inside USAID.
Great. Yes, thank you. So I just want to do a time check. It is 20 minutes past the hour, whatever hour you are on, where you are. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I just want to direct everybody's attention to the chat. We have a really dynamic, vibrant, full of ideas and comments chat today. We will be saving the chat. We will make sure that it reads correctly. And I'm looking at Jessica to give me a nod to make sure that everything I'm saying is technically possible. And we will be including the chat in what we make available after the sessions. So just want to confirm everybody. And I want to thank everybody who's been active in the chat. I have been trying to look at it and listen to our speakers at the same time, which is a bit of a challenge. I think that we've been covering quite a bit of what's going on in the chat in this discussion, because people in the panel are also looking at the chat, which is great. Because we have 9 minutes left, I want to just go back to our speakers and give them a chance to say anything else that's on their mind. I do want to call out, if any of you want to speak to this before we close. In the chat, I've seen several people refer to small businesses and their role in this. And Gavin, I think you talked about small businesses actually on the non-US side and how they are actually not favored in the way that small business is involved in assistance and acquisition right now. So I do want to give a nod to that issue that has been going through the chat. Invite anyone to speak to that or anything else that you want to speak to. So each of you is going to have 2 minutes. Larry, I would like you to start, please.
I'll start, if I could, on this small business issue. I was arguing before against the zero-sum logic, but this is a case where it really does apply. And if you put yourself in the position of a US larger business prime contractor competing for an aid award, it is a complex decision. Do you go for local partners or do you go for US small businesses as subcontractors or as partners in that? And I think that's a tough decision at this particular moment in time because they're both imperatives. And so some decision or some sorting out on USAID's part, I believe, would help in terms of how to prioritize the fact that there are genuinely some trade-offs involved in the process. I also think that there are a lot of opportunities to make this a more attractive proposition for local players than have been exercised so far. For sure, there are things that are possible through grants that are not possible through contracts. But as all of you who are listening probably know, the movement away from grants toward cooperative agreements and contracts has been really continuous over the last couple of decades. And the number of grants that are really granting resources to local organizations to pursue their own missions has become a smaller and smaller dimension. And that not only constricts local voice, it also constricts local participation. Within the contracting arena, there are also a number of things that aid used to do that it doesn't do anymore, like pre-qualifying groups, the way that it used to be done for IQCs. There's no reason that couldn't be done with local organizations as well that did not require the same elaborated competitive process. There's the kind of two-stage work that Randy was talking about, where it's possible to engage people early on and then work with them to develop something that, assuming it meets USAID's requirements, could be implemented without recourse to another process and without recourse to another year that would intervene in the process. There's a whole series of things that seem to me could be done to make the relationship with local partners analogous to and a link to getting local governments and local philanthropists to work with those same organizations to augment the kind of work that's funded by foreign assistance that's not yet being done successfully. And in my last stage of my career, I've been working a lot more with these heavy net worth people who are doing philanthropic work. And I'm struck by their ability to, in some cases, really transform the marketplace for local organizations on this. So I think there's a lot of unexplored terrain in this for organizations that are truly committed not only to local participation in contracting, but also to local voice in decision making.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks for addressing that. We have 5 minutes left. I want to make sure that we hear from Professor Churchyard, Gavin, again. So over to you, and then we'll see where that takes us. You're muted.
Apologies, we're having a thunderstorm here, so that's why I muted myself. I just want to address the issue of the accountability and compliance. And in the traditional prime sub-relationship, we are buffered from the more onerous aspects, particularly from a contract for compliance. But when we are successful and we are the prime, then the compliance that is imposed on us as local partners is much more intense than what's normally applied on the international partners in the north. And we drown in audits. We are constantly being audited. We will often have, not just one or two, but 3 or 4 auditors from different US departments auditing us. It consumes so much time and effort and creates so much stress. And I'm not sure how helpful it is in really raising the quality of what we do and delivering. And so, that's part of being more equitable, making sure that the compliance is appropriate that we have to deliver on, and that we do have the systems to support it. And that there's a co-reliance on auditing across the departments, so that we're not just constantly being audited. But that's a unique experience that we have, is we are audited today.
I think it's really an important thing to point out. And I think it's also just one example of how, because so much of regulation and compliance is flow down, technically, I guess, in the United States, sometimes you'll get a form and it will say, it should take 10 minutes to do this form. And I don't think that we necessarily think about that in terms of the compliance that we flow down on partners. And to your point, when there are multiple channels of this flowing down, it means that you are doing the same exercise or a similar exercise over and over and over for different partners, different donors, when in fact there could be much more consolidation. And so I'm going to come back to one of the points that was raised very early in our discussion. I'm going to close on the idea that greater donor and partner coordination and alignment, I don't think we said alignment, we said coordination, but alignment is critical to actually making the operationalization of this work when we talk about working within the parameters of donor funding. That is absolutely critical. I'll go back to the idea. Oh, Randy, go ahead.
Christine, do you mind just a brief response to Professor Churchyard? Drowning in audits is something I'm sure so many on this webinar can relate to. And it reminds me, I wanted to say something I sacrificed in order to make another point. We focused a great deal of attention on pay for results approaches. And some of this is just coming to fruition now. USAID has issued new guidance on fixed amount awards. These are paying not cost reimbursement, but paying for the achievement of results, and often milestones or steps in the process toward a development outcome. They are not cost reimbursement, but they are based on cost principles in setting the price for those achieved outcomes. These are not exclusively for local partners, but they're ideal for local partners. And I think I would like to draw the attention of the listeners to the new fixed amount award guidance. And there's a continuing need for regulatory change that will increase the amount allowable for a fixed amount subaward. Again, the importance of subawards, allowing local partners or less experienced partners to perform against results. And I'd just like to mention what USAID has done to create the Work with USAID platform is really important. Everybody, especially local partners, but everybody should go check out the Work with USAID platform introduced this year. It's something that was developed under the new partnerships initiative by the partnerships incubator led by Kaizen, which has really performed extraordinarily well in providing full service on behalf of USAID to all prospective or partners that aspire to work with USAID. Very important to check that out. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Jessica has dropped the link into the chat. Yeah, and so I'm gonna have to wrap this up here. I do want to just mention one other idea, which I think is so important in this, is this idea of partnerships of consequence. We want all of this must be done with consequence. It is not a tick the box exercise. And so as we work towards transforming the sector, as we address these structural issues and systemic issues, we need to think about how we do it with consequence, and we need to do it with all voices at the table and being consulted and listened to and taken into account in what we put in place. With that, I want to thank all of our speakers. Really so pleased to be able to meet with you today. I find these energizing and reaffirming in what we are all trying to do. I invite everybody to continue to follow what Humentum will be putting together and to work with us in all of the various things that we do. And I thank all of our participants today and our audience and really everybody who's contributed to the chat. This has been a great event, and I look forward to the next one and to seeing you all soon. Thanks again to our panelists, and I wish everybody a good day, and please be well, stay healthy, wear a mask. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.